I mean, I could listen to Rabbi Shlomo Katz sing the Rova Chuppah Nigun all day long. Nina originally brought that song to my attention years ago, and we just love it. We share it everywhere we go. It's such a beautiful, beautiful nigun. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. We've got a really special show tonight. I know you're going to love it. Who is going to be with us as we do some learning on a Monday night? Stephen Giger from New Hampshire. Yehudit says, Erev Tov, a good evening from South Carolina. Nancy from North Carolina. Pauline from Arkansas. John in Sedona. Gail in Virginia. Renee says, Shalom. Lucinda with us from Little Rock. Nancy loves the music too. It's gorgeous. Christo says, love the title of this episode. It's one of our Meet the Mensch series. We're going to go into the life of one of the sages. Very special tonight. James says, shalom from Indianapolis. Sheila from Montana. Pauline, also in Little Rock. Chaim in Charlotte. Ginny, Concord, New Hampshire. The ancestral lands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples. Thank you, Ginny. Robert in Ohio. Judy saying shalom to everybody. Eve in Vancouver, British Columbia. Bill with us from Arkansas. Where am I? Judy in Irvine. Krista says he hates missing the live shows so often now, but definitely watches all the recordings. And I know that there's a lot of people, this is not a convenient time for everybody. And we get a lot of messages that people watch it every day, but not, can't do it live. And I just want to know that we see your comments and we receive your messages. And hello to my dear pals across the time divide. You're watching it a little later, but we're fully connected, whether it's live or not. Fred from Miami Beach. Peter in Livingston, New Jersey, Carolyn in North Carolina, Patsy in Ohio, Paul in Chicago, Melissa in Great Neck, New York. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie with us in Georgia, and Brandon in Knoxville. Welcome, everybody. Okay, tonight's show is dedicated when people are dedicating for a healing, I don't read whole names because I want to be mindful of the privacy, of the person who is ill and is being prayed for. But Lisa G is dedicating this episode for the healing of her sister, Linda C. And Nina expressed this beautifully. May your prayers and ours for your sister be answered favorably and quickly, and may Linda experience revealed miracles and a speedy recovery. May she achieve a fully healthy status again soon, and may she stay healthy to 120, and we say Amen. Also dedicating tonight is Akiva Balter of Toronto, Canada, in honor of Nina and me and our family. So thank you very much, Akiva. And may the blesser be blessed. We say that always. When people dedicate, when people bless us, it's a beautiful thing to say back. May the blesser be blessed. You and your family should be blessed in every way possible. All right. So where are we holding? This is Pesachim, the fourth volume of the Talmud. We're on page 16. That is Daf Tes Zion. We're in chapter 1, continuing our discussion of the fifth Mishna. Excuse me. So I'm gonna explain how where we are in this Mishnah and how we're gonna get to this ruling of Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida. Excuse me. So Yosei ben Yoezer is a very important figure in sort of Talmudic history, in the history of our sages. And we're going to be talking about him momentarily. So let me just get us to the place where we have Yosei's ruling, and then we're going to meet the Mensch. This is one of the Meet the Mensch episodes. I think we've had like 6 or 7, maybe some more. And, I spaced them out. There are so many sages in the Talmud. Not enough is known about all of them to sort of do a biographical sketch, but wherever that is possible, we hope to do that during our 7.5-year journey. If you want to see if you missed some, want to check out some of the other Meet the Mensch episodes, those are going to be available on our website at accidentaltalmudist.org, where we go to the AT Daily section, and we have, I'm pretty sure we've got the Meet the Mensch. If we don't, we'll make a special section, but I think we've already got that set up. We also have key dafs, right? So really important episodes that just, address fundamental Talmudic concepts, and usually those are actually quite entertaining shows as well. So there's just every episode, and then also a special section for key dafs and the Meet the Mensch series. And by the way, if you love what you're hearing on AT Daily and the other posts that we put out, we are in our annual campaign. Support our work. Tremendous impact around the world. When you give to our nonprofit, you're promoting the sharing of Jewish wisdom and Torah across the globe. And that's a huge merit to you and your family. And that's at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Nina will put the link in the comments. All right. In our Mishna that we've been discussing for a few days now, the 5th Mishna of chapter 1, Rabbi Meir, the question that's being addressed is whether on Erev Pesach, the eve of Passover, when we have to destroy our chametz, our leaven, when we're talking about consecrated leaven, so like bread products that were consecrated by being set aside to give to the priests as part of the tithe, and that's called teruma. Only a priest can eat it, and a priest can only eat it if it's in a state of purity. Now all the chametz has to be destroyed. It's either going to be sold to a non-Jew, or at least some of it is always going to be burned in a fire on Erev Pesach. And the question becomes, since it's going to be destroyed in a fire, can we take the tamei and tahor teruma? Can we take this bread consecrated for the use only of the priest, some of which is in a state of ritual purity, tahara, and some of which is in a state of ritual impurity, tuma, and destroy them together? They're going to be destroyed anyway, but generally we have a principle that we're going to guard anything that's been consecrated for the use of the priests in a state of purity, and we don't let it come into contact with things that are impure. So if we mix the pure and impure consecrated bread of the priest together, even for the purposes of burning, we are going to lower that purity level of the teruma. And is that going to be permitted? Rabbi Meir says yes, and he looks for support in his position to a statement in the Mishnah of Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest at the end of the Second Temple period. He served in the temple. He was the deputy high priest, which meant that he was always ready to assume the duties of the high priest if for some reason the high priest became incapacitated. He was there, he served, he saw how it was done. And his statement was that consecrated offerings of flesh, right, animals that were brought for sacrifices on the altar, that would be, it could be a cow, could be a goat, could be a lamb. And sometimes they became disqualified, and then they would have to be burned to be destroyed because they couldn't be used for anything else, since they couldn't be offered on the altar because they had become impure. And what he said was these meats that should have gone up on the altar but became disqualified through some kind of tuma, ritual impurity, sometimes they would have different levels of tuma, of impurity. Nevertheless, the priest did not refrain from burning them together. Therefore, it would seem that we're not going to be concerned that we're adding to the impurity of one of these sacred offerings when we put it with other offerings that are more impure to be destroyed on this fire. And so Rabbi Meir looks to that as support for his position that we can burn pure and impure leaven that was consecrated for the priests. he's challenged, other sages challenge him and say, well, wait a minute, you're talking about mixing pure and impure, and your evidence that we're allowed to do that is that they mixed impure and impure of different levels of impurity. But what we're seeing is there's a difference between whether something is pure according to Torah law, or let's say impure according to Torah law, or impure by rabbinic decree. Why? Because the sages made a fence around the Torah, and they issued decrees even beyond what the Torah said to protect us from coming to transgress the rules of the Torah, right? That fence around the Torah is for our protection, so we don't come to make inadvertent transgressions of Torah laws. So perhaps the reason that Rabbi Meir can look to this statement of Rabbi Hanina, where impure and impure were burned together, and the only difference between them was sort of different levels of impurity. But in fact, the impurity of one of those meats might only be by rabbinic decree, whereas by Torah law, it was pure. And then therefore Rabbi Meir would have a leg to stand on, and he would say, no, they were, according to Torah law, they were mixing pure meat with impure meat, and that had both become unfit through impurity. They had been disqualified. One was disqualified according to rabbinic decree. The other was disqualified because of its impurity according to Torah law. And then they mixed those two together for when they needed to destroy them. And so that should provide support for Rabbi Meir's position that we can mix pure and impure teruma in that pyre of destruction on the eve of Passover when we're getting rid of all our chametz. All right, that's where we've been. So to clarify that, Rabbi Yirmiyah says that these two levels of impurity that Rabbi Hanina was talking about, what were they? So there was meat that had come into contact with an av hatuma, a source of ritual impurity. And as we discussed a few days ago, if you missed that class, the sort of class breaking down what is tahara and tuma, ritual purity and impurity in Judaism, that's when you want to make up. Go back and see we just broke down what is ritual purity and impurity in Judaism. So an av hatuma is a source of impurity, and that could be like a dead sheretz, a dead creeping animal that are listed in the Torah, or a person who has had some kind of irregular event that's defined in the Torah, like some kind of a nocturnal emission, or a woman in her menses, a woman who's had childbirth, and there's a person who has tsaras, which is a kind of skin outbreak that's related to a spiritual malady, no longer exists, but did exist when the temple was standing. So those people who are experiencing that are an av hatuma, a source of impurity. Then there was the avi avos hatuma, the father of fathers of impurity, which is a human dead body. A human dead body is such a strong source of tuma, of ritual impurity, that if a human touches a human corpse, he becomes a source of impurity, even though it doesn't stem from himself. It's derived from touching the corpse. Nevertheless, that's not considered derived impurity. The person who touches a corpse is now himself a source of impurity. So one of these offerings, these kodashim, right, these animals that were going to be offered on the altar, this flesh, and it became disqualified. So one of it, the higher level impurity, is that that meat touched a source of tuma, like one of these sources that I just mentioned. And the other meat of the lower level of impurity touched something that derived its impurity, right? Is not a source of tuma, but it itself contracted its tuma by touching something else that was an av hatuma, that was a source of tuma. So this meat that touched something that was of a secondary, of derived ritual impurity. So what was it? In this case, what we're talking about, it's liquid. Right? So this would be that meat somehow came into contact with liquid, and the liquid came into contact with a source of tuma. So let's say the dead sheretz, the dead creeping animal. Certain creeping animals, when they're dead, they impart this ritual impurity, and so it was imparted on a liquid. And as we'll see, the big debate, and we're not going to fully explore this debate because it's technical and complicated and a little bit too much, I think, for our class. But the nut of the debate, as it were, the crux of it, is whether liquids can contract impurity. Right? So for sure, by rabbinic decree, yes, liquids can contract impurity. But according to Torah law, there's a disagreement whether a liquid can actually become tamei at all. Some sages say yes, some sages say no. And then they're going to further debate, well, the liquid can become ritually impure, but can it transmit that impurity onto another object? There's going to be further debate about that. Now, as we've learned, the word tamei generally means something that is ritually impure and can transmit that ritual impurity, to another object, sort of, further the chain of ritual impurity, one thing touching another. But as we've seen with respect to teruma and kodashim, right, the tithe of food that's consecrated to the priest, or actual offerings that are meant for the altar, when they are touched by tuma, they become pasul. They become impure, but they don't transmit that impurity. But with regard to liquids, which are like foods, some say that it can become ritually impure, it can become tamei, and it can transmit that tuma. Others say it can become tamei, but it's not really the right use of that word. More like they become pasul through ritual impurity, but they cannot transmit that ritual impurity. And others say it can't contract ritual impurity at all, because impurity is really something that attaches to objects and to solid food, but not to liquid, according to some sages. So that's the debate that we find ourselves in. So Rabbi Meir views the meats that Rabbi Hanina was talking about as tamei by Torah law and tahor by Torah law, meaning that according to Rabbi Meir, in this particular analysis of what Rabbi Meir may have meant, he said that when Rabbi Hanina was saying that they mix these meats of different levels of impurity, one meat was definitely impure according to Torah law. The other meat was only impure according to Rabbinic law, because it came into contact with this liquid that had become tamei because it touched a dead sheretz, a dead creeping thing. And so that liquid becoming impure and transmitting its impurity to the meat of the sacred offerings could have only happened by rabbinic decree, and therefore, according to Torah law, they were burning pure and impure together. The priests were on the temple grounds. And as we've seen before, generally speaking, something that became impure by rabbinic decree actually is pure within the realm of the temple, because generally speaking, rabbinic decrees don't apply in the grounds of the holy temple when the temple is standing. The priests are already held to such a high standard. They are very well educated in what the rules are. They don't need a fence around the Torah. So when the rabbis issue decrees about purity and impurity, it doesn't really take hold on the grounds of the temple, the physical grounds of the temple. And that's why Rabbi Meir could learn out from Rabbi Hanina's report that the priests never refrained from mixing the meat of offerings together at different levels of impurity. Rabbi Meir might learn out from that, well, in fact, they were mixing pure and impure together by Torah law. But they were impure at different levels of impurity only when you take rabbinic law into account. It's a bit of a stretch because it didn't really say that. The sages are kind of learning into it, but they say maybe Rabbi Meir could find support using this kind of reasoning. Now, Rabbi Yosei disagreed with Rabbi Meir and said, yeah, we do not burn pure and impure chametz together. And as we saw yesterday, that's during the rabbinically decreed hour of burning the chametz before noon. After noon on the day of Passover. Passover begins at night. That afternoon is when we slaughter the Passover offering. At that time, we're not allowed to possess leaven. And for sure, you have to get rid of it. The sages decreed we get rid of it an hour before noon, just to make that fence around the Torah, have that buffer so people don't come to have leaven in their possession after it becomes biblically prohibited in the afternoon. So during that hour when we burn, because it's prohibited to own leaven for a Jew, by rabbinic decree, we don't mix pure and impure leaven and burn them together. We do it separately. That's according to Rabbi Yosei. Once we hit the afternoon, where it's prohibited to have it at all, then we just burn everything that's left over. And even if we burn pure and impure chametz together, we do it because by then you really needed to get it done. The burning should have been done before noon, not afternoon. If some is left, burn it right away, even if we mix pure and impure. Okay, now Rabbi Meir could find support for his view according to this analysis of Rabbi Meir, because there's another analysis where it says, no, this is not what Rabbi Meir holds, but we're just going along with this one right now. So according to this view, Rabbi Meir could find support from a Baraisa where Rabbi Elazar says that there is no tuma, no ritual impurity for liquids at all to receive or transmit according to Torah law, right? And so for liquids to become tamei, it's only by rabbinic decree. And so where does Rabbi Elazar get this? That by Torah law, there is no tuma for liquids. He looks to Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida, who testified in two matters. Yosei ben Yoezer, the son of Yosei, the son of Yoezer of Tzereida, said, number one, there's a certain kind of grasshopper called the El Kamtza, and it's a kosher grasshopper, right? So there are certain insects that are kosher to eat. Most are not. The ones that are kosher are enumerated in the Torah. It's a little bit hard to know sometimes, well, what particular species did the Hebrew in the Torah referring to this grasshopper mean? And he said this particular grasshopper called an El, the species known in Hebrew as the El Kamtza is a kosher species of grasshopper for eating. But he also said that all liquids in the slaughterhouse of the temple. Now remember, the temple is a place where animal sacrifices were brought. So there were a lot of animals being slaughtered there, particularly on Erev Pesach, when so many people are bringing the Paschal offering and it gets slaughtered on the grounds of the temple, and then they take the slaughtered animal and roast it and eat it that night for the Passover Seder. But there's a lot of slaughtering that goes on the Temple Mount when the temple is standing. And according to Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida, all the liquids in the slaughterhouse, meaning blood and water, that are collected there, right? The blood that comes out of the animals and spills on the ground, and then maybe they bring buckets of water to wash it out. All those liquids are tahor, pure, ritually pure. They neither become impure nor do they transmit impurity. So therefore, if all those liquids for sure are pure and they cannot become impure, what do we learn from that? That by Torah law, liquids are pure. They cannot be impure according to Torah law. The rabbis may have decreed that they become tamei for different policy reasons, but biblically speaking, all liquids are pure. And since rabbinic decrees are not in effect in the temple, at least with respect to purity and impurity, that's how we see that all liquids remain pure. The blood and the water that are on the ground in the temple, pure. We don't have to worry that they have become tamei. Now, who was this Yosei ben Yoezer, whose decree or at least report we're relying on as support for Rabbi Meir's position? This is a very special man, Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida was one of the pairs. In fact, he was the first of the pairs of rabbis that are listed in the chain of transmission of the oral Torah, which began with Moses at Mount Sinai. So if you look at Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers, or the Chapters of the Fathers, this is a beautiful edition with the commentary of the Maharal of Prague. But there's many, many editions of Pirkei Avos. But the very beginning of Pirkei Avos, so these are Mishnas. Avos is a book of Mishnah. It's part of the Talmud. It actually does not have Gemaras. So we don't have that secondary layer of commentary from the Amoraim, in the later that added to either the Jerusalem Talmud or the Babylonian Talmud. But who are referenced here are Tanaim, right? The rabbis of the Mishnaic period. So the chain of transmission, this is how Pirkei Avos starts. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. Now, when it says Moshe received the Torah, it means God dictated to him the written Torah and gave him a whole bunch of oral teachings that would sort of explicate the Torah. Some of the laws that were given to Moses at Sinai that are oral laws, right, that were not written down, but they were meant to be transmitted from teacher to student, throughout time, in every generation, because not only are they laws that explain written laws, but it also initiates the process of the oral law and the oral tradition, which the sages will add to in every generation, sort of figuring out how to fulfill the written law takes a little bit of an instruction manual. The classic example is that in the written Torah, it says that you shall bind these words, that the Lord is one, as a sign upon your hand and a symbol before your eyes. That's all it says. That is tefillin. That's the commandment for tefillin, and a Jewish man is obligated to wrap tefillin every day. But tefillin is never explained. It just says it. These words as a sign on your hand and a symbol before your eyes. But that black box with the scroll inside and the black leather straps was actually shown to Moses at Mount Sinai, and he transmitted that teaching along with sort of the core of the oral tradition. Right? It's not like this massive Talmud was all transmitted to Moses at Mount Sinai, but there was just a series of core laws that were, along with this sort of the process for deriving new laws in order to understand the written laws in every generation. It was an important feature of the Torah that there would be both a written Torah and an oral Torah, so that the sages could adjust as the world kept changing. The written Torah is timeless, eternal, unchanging, but the world keeps changing, and there are all these novel situations, right? I mean, when you think about the technology that keeps getting added into the world, new technology didn't start only 200 years ago. In every century there has been new technology. When the printing press was added, when a Pony Express of communication was added. I mean, when changes happened in world history, questions of law would come up, and the sages needed to have a way of dealing with that, and that's what the oral tradition is all about. So Moshe received the Torah from Sinai. He transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua transmitted it to the elders to the prophets. The prophets, there's a long period of the prophets, right? There were prophets all through the first temple period. So this is like 800 years after the Torah was given at Sinai until the end of the first temple period. Pretty much prophecy ended there. We get into the second temple period, and now this chain of the oral law transmission goes from the prophets to the men of the great assembly. And they, the men of the great assembly, said three things: be deliberate in judgment, have many students, and build a fence around the Torah, right? So it's as early as that we have this principle of building a fence around the Torah. The men of the great assembly, the last of them was Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik said that the world stands on three things: Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim. That's Torah, written and oral. Avodah, service of God, right? Serving God, submitting to God, and offering our service to God. And Gemilut Chasadim, doing deeds of loving kindness, right? Good deeds. he transmitted the tradition to Antignos, the leader of Soho. Antignos said, do not be like a servant who serves his master for the sake of a reward. Be like a servant who serves his master not for the sake of a reward. And the fear of heaven should be upon you, right? You should be a person who is happy to serve God, not because you think you're gonna get a reward for serving God. It's like the reward is the service. And you should cultivate a state of being in awe of heaven, of God at all times. That's what Antignos taught. And then it was Antignos who was the last of the individuals who sort of possessed the whole tradition and was able to transmit it. He was the last individual who had received the whole tradition, mastered it, and was able to transmit it, to the next generation as a single individual. After Antignos, the leader of Soho, the next generation was led, in terms of Torah, was led by two individuals. This is the first pair, and there's going to be a series of pairs. And the first pair is Yosei ben Yoezer, who we're talking about today, and his colleague Yosei ben Yochanan. So they were a pair. Yosei ben Yoezer was the Nasi. He was the head of the Sanhedrin, the sort of, the chief of the Rabbinic court. And so in this generation, tragically, it's interesting that we're coming to this as Hanukkah is approaching at the end of this week, because Yosei ben Yoezer is alive in the time of Antiochus, right? Who is the villain in the Hanukkah story. And in fact, Yosei ben Yoezer his life will end tragically as a martyr. And he's going to be martyred in that conflict. So what was going on at that time is that there were these Hellenists, right? These were the assimilated Jews who said, Torah, Jewish faith, it's old-fashioned. We don't need that. We want to be modern. We want to join the civilized world like the Greeks, right? The Greeks are the height of civilization. And in order to join the Greeks and participate, in their athletic contests and their, salons to talk philosophy and to do business with them. So we're going to, shave our beards, and we're going to stop circumcising, and we're going to get rid of this, old-fashioned superstitious religion of our fathers and become like the Greeks, right? Which is a mega transgression. Like, these were idolaters, worshiped the pantheon of gods, and, could not be worse. Could not be worse. And really, at this point, the kingdom is headed toward the destruction. It's gonna take a little while, another maybe 100 to 200 years before it's fully realized and the second temple is destroyed. But at this point already, the nation is seriously sliding. And tragically, there were even chief priests, like Kohen Gadol, like the high priest serving in the temple, who had been corrupted by these secular influences, and really the spiritual level of the nation had descended very much. And so there was political leadership of the nation that was uninterested in Torah. But the political leader of the Torah world was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, and then his deputy was the Av Beis Din, the head of the Rabbinic court. And so they were both, they were sharing the political leadership of the Torah world. Why do you need two guys? Because now the spiritual level of the nation has fallen so much that what's also being introduced is halachic disputes, right? It's the advent of the pairs that what's really going on is they can no longer agree on what is the law. It's like the clarity of Torah had come down as the spiritual level of the nation came down. And so it's with this generation, Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida and Yosei ben Yochanan of Yerushalayim, I mean, they love each other. They're colleagues. They're going to have different points of view, and they're going to have some disagreements. And the first major halachic dispute in the Torah world actually has to do with bringing an offering in the temple, and whether the person bringing the offering, who does something called semicha, where they lean their hands on the animal while it's still alive before it is slaughtered, to be offered on the altar. It's just part of that process to lean your hands on it, I think in front of the priest. And the question was, could you do that on a festival, or should you have done that before the festival? And Yosei ben Yoezer says you should have done it before the festival, and Yosei ben Yochanan says you could do it on the festival. It's not that dramatic a disagreement, but it was the beginning of this kind of halachic dispute that actually showed that, prior to that, the law was so well understood by the religious leadership of the nation that this kind of dissension didn't creep into it. And from now on, there will be more and more and more halachic disputes and kind of balkanization and splintering of different, religious factions within the nation. Okay, so that's a little bit of history right there. But like I said, they disagreed on this issue of smicha, but they agreed on, everything else. And in drawing a fence around the Torah, as they had learned, right, from, who was it that said that? Was that Shimon Hatzad? No, the men of the Great Assembly draw a fence around the Torah. So they issued as together a couple of decrees. One was that all of the nations outside Israel, where there's not, a Jewish majority, they decreed tuma on the other nations, meaning that somebody who walks around in anywhere on earth that's outside of Israel at that time is going to be assumed to have walked over a grave, right? Because in Israel, this idea that you need to know where every grave is, because if you walk over a grave, you can contract tuma, ritual impurity from it, which is very bad for a priest, right? So priests walk around in the land, they need to know where the graves are. Outside of Israel, no one has that obligation. It's a Jewish thing. It doesn't apply to non-Jews. And since it doesn't matter outside of Israel whether, where a grave might be located, a doubt arises. There might be unmarked graves anywhere you go. And so they just said anyone who goes outside Israel, when you come back, you're going to have to immerse and purify before you can enter the temple. If you've walked outside of Israel, by rabbinic decree, you've contracted tuma back then. Today, when the temple has been gone for 2,000 years, the whole world, this decree still stands. And that's why we're all in a state of tuma, walking around in the world. And even in Israel, I'm not sure how that applies in Israel or not today. I'm not sure how that applies. But they also decreed together that glass could become tamei, which under Torah law, that glass was not one of the substances that was subject to ritual impurity. But they said, because glass had not been used for vessels commonly, when the Torah was given. That was a new technology, in the 1,000 years after that. And so they said, well, how are we going to handle glass? Since it's typically used for vessels the way that metal and wood and earthenware were before, we're going to have to deal with it. And they said that glass can contract tuma by rabbinic decree. Okay. So, all right. So that was Yosei ben Yoezer and his partner, his colleague, Yosei ben Yochanan. And, as I said, tragically, they lived during the time of this Hellenization in the Holy Land. And there was this large number of Jews who, wanted to take the nation that way and just get away from Torah and the temple and the priests and sacrifices and just sacrifice to the Greek gods and, dress and name themselves and speak Greek and just assimilate and be Greek. And it was a terrible, terrible thing for the Jewish people. And because the Torah world, was furious about it and resisting it with all their heart and soul, really the people were coming to a state of civil war. The pro-Greek faction ready to kill and go to war with the pro-Torah faction. And it was in that heated, supercharged atmosphere that the religious leadership, people like Yosei ben Yoezer, came to be, condemned and then publicly executed. So Yosei ben Yoezer died a martyr's death. As he was being marched to his execution by hanging, and the beam that would carry the rope was sort of in front of him. So his nephew, a guy named Yaakov, was one of these Hellenists, right? One of these anti-Torah, pro-assimilation Jews. And Yaakov actually mocked his uncle, who is the Nasi, the chief of the Sanhedrin, that he's going to his death. And like Yaakov is saying, like, this is proof, that we're right. If your God is letting you die like this, he must not be so powerful. And so what did he say? Yaakov's line was, Yaakov mockingly remarked to Yosei ben Yoezer, see the horse that my master has given me to ride, right? His master meaning, these Hellenistic powers that be, and see your horse, i.e. the beam from which Yosei ben Yoezer was to be hanged, that your master, meaning God, has given you to ride, right? Just mocking him as he's on his way to his execution. So to this, Yosei ben Yoezer replied to his mocking nephew, if God grants such pleasantness to those that anger him, how much more so will God's goodness be granted to those that fulfill his will? And if such suffering is meted out to those that fulfill his will, how much more so will it be meted out to those that anger him? Now, clearly this was Yosei's point of view, right? He's a Torah Jew, now walking to his martyrdom and still, in faith with God. So of course he believes that, my reward is in the next world. I have full faith in God. There's some reason for this terrible suffering that I'm undergoing. And you who seem to be prospering in this world, you'll meet your end. You'll get your just desserts at some point. Maybe not in this world, maybe in the next, but you'll get yours. So we know that would be his point of view. But the way that he said this, the way he said, if Hashem grants such pleasantness to those that anger him, how much more so will it be granted to those that fulfill his will? And if Hashem metes out such suffering to those who fulfill his will, how much more so will it be meted out to those who anger him? So there's a little bit in the wording that he chose, but I'm sure even much more in the delivery to his nephew who mocked him as he was on his way to his own execution. Something about the way he said this to the nephew stung the nephew like he'd been bitten by a snake. And he realized that his whole bravado of, I know I'm on the right track and you're old-fashioned people of faith, you're idiots, it just crumbled in that moment. And the nephew ended up making a teshuvah by performing upon himself the death sentence that he would receive for his heresy and for what he'd done. And the way that he not just performed idolatry, but promoted idolatry in the land, was one of the leaders of this Hellenistic movement to drive Jews away from Torah. And that the correct sentence for him was death. And he carried out that death sentence upon himself. And because of that, because he made that atonement, it's a very extreme atonement, he actually, at the end of his life, was able to earn his place in the next world, said Yosei ben Yoezer. So, the rebuke of Yosei ben Yoezer, even as he himself was on his way to his execution, was effective on the most Hellenized person, a leader of that Hellenistic movement, his nephew, who had mocked him. All right, now that we know who Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida was, Let's read his teaching that comes here in Pirkei Avos. This is chapter 1, Mishnah number 4. It's very brief. But Yosei ben Yoezer, the leader of Tzereida, and Yosei ben Yochanan, the leader of Jerusalem, received the Torah from them, right? From Antigonus, the leader of Soho in the previous generation, and Shimon HaTzadik, who came before him. And Yosei ben Yoezer says, let your house be a meeting place for sages, and sit in the dust of their feet, and drink in their words thirstily. Ramchal teaches, let your house be a meeting place for sages, meaning, first of all, cultivate relationships with people that can add wisdom to your home. Promote that discussions in your home should be about Torah, about ethics, about elevating ourselves, about the service of God, right? The topics of conversation in our homes, in our living rooms, in our dining rooms especially, should be about wisdom. Sit in the dust of their feet means honor the sages. Know that you don't know everything, right? God knows I know so little. I mean, I've learned a little more than some of you because I went through the whole Talmud once, and now I'm learning every day at a deep level. It takes me hours to prepare so that I can teach this. But I'm nothing, nothing compared to real sages, right? And let me tell you that the greatest sages of our generation would say that they are nothing compared to the sages of the previous generation. And those sages would say they're nothing compared to the sages of the previous generation. And somehow a little bit of that revelation of Torah that was given to Moses at Sinai and that he transmitted to Joshua and Joshua to the elders, in every generation, a little was lost, a little more was lost, a little more was lost. And so the greatest wisdom and the greatest revelation that existed in the world is not now. It was at Sinai 3,000 years ago. We're just trying to recover the echoes of that wisdom that entered the world then. So this is another reason why we defer and honor our elders, right? By definition, our elders are closer to the revelation at Sinai than we are. And of course, there are young and very wise people, but we have to be humble around people, who have spent their lives learning, and drink in their words thirstily. Honor them, humble ourselves so we can learn more. Arrogance it's death on Torah learning, right? Arrogance is like a wall that prevents us from learning as much as we might otherwise learn. Okay, so to return to the topic of our daf, just very briefly, so the law is that the tuma of liquids to receive is by Torah law. So liquids can become tamei by Torah law, but they can't transmit their ritual impurity to other objects. That's only by rabbinic decree, not by Torah law. The blood and water in the slaughterhouses, in the slaughterhouse of the temple, is always pure because it's the blood of offerings that are going up on the altar. And that's going to be a special case. But the blood of non-sacred domesticated animals it's not so much about it becomes tamei, but we've seen elsewhere that for a food, for grain, for example, to become tamei, to become ritually impure, it has to become susceptible to impurity by first coming into contact with a liquid. Dry grain that has never had any moisture cannot become tamei. Has to come into contact with one of the 7 liquids that are defined elsewhere, but they include blood and water and oil and honey and milk. And I'm just not going to get all of them right now. But they have to come into contact with one of the 7 liquids just so that they have the chance to become tamei, to become ritually impure. Doesn't mean they are impure. But the question is blood capable of making dry food susceptible to tuma? Interesting, yes and no. So the blood, when you slaughter, when you make a kosher slaughter of an animal, you have to make a sharp cut, through its neck. and the blood that spurts out, that's blood, like the defined term, blood. And that's where the blood is the life, right? So that blood that spills out, it's prohibited for a Jew to consume any of it. It has to be spilled out on the ground and then covered up. If it's an offering, some of that blood will go in a vessel, and then it'll be sprinkled and offered up on the altar. But when we talk about blood, like with a capital B, that kind of blood is capable of, does render food susceptible to tuma like the other 6 liquids. But blood that kind of squeezes out of the animal later, after it's already dead, that's not blood with a capital B, and that does not render food susceptible to tuma. These are technicalities I will actually get into at a later time. And just a quick note in passing, and now I'm coming to your comments and questions. We just didn't have time for it tonight, but our page also talks a little bit about the tzitz, which is a gold metal plate that the high priest serving in the temple would wear on his forehead, that basically said "holy to God," right? That everything he does in the temple is dedicated to the service of God. But that particular object, the gold plate with this writing on it, that only the high priest would wear it while performing his obligations in the holy temple, itself had the power to atone for certain transgressions, meaning mistakes that the priest might make in bringing the offerings. And our sages on our page here will debate, which mistakes does the tzitz atone for? And again, it gets into a technical discussion about that. But basically, certain offerings that by mistake are brought in a state of impurity inadvertently by the priests. So one might think that will be an offense to God, even though they didn't do it on purpose, that they put an offering on the altar in a state of impurity, but the tzitz, this gold plate on the high priest's forehead, atones for those mistakes. And then which exact mistakes is the subject of that discussion, which we're not going to get into tonight. Okay, let me check your comments and questions. Joe Luna says, I really appreciate how you make sections that can be tedious to study come alive and be so interesting and relevant. Thank you, Joe. I really appreciate that. And he goes on and he says, today, mucho. You have freed me up to study sections of Tanakh, Talmud, Targum, Tanya, Nefesh HaChaim, and other halachic works while staying on track with you and not neglecting my responsibilities to cover everything. Also, you shed much light on the topics as you are gifted. You're very sweet, Joe. I really appreciate that. And he signs that grateful in North California. Nina and I do all this work together. We really appreciate, when you say such sweet things as that. I never could have imagined that I'd be sitting in this seat and teaching. I feel like there's so many more people, who know so much more of Talmudic law than I do. But God put me in this seat. I guess I come from the world of not knowing anything. So I know what I used to not know. And because I'm a communicator, and Nina and I are a screenwriting team, and I'm a director, and so I'm so involved in communication and helping people follow the story in a movie and transmitting it in an entertaining way. So we feel like we've been placed in this position to make this oral tradition accessible to everybody without dumbing it down, right? To make it accessible without dumbing it down. That's our goal. And if we succeed sometimes, it's really, it gives us a tremendous joy. And if you support the work that we do and making it accessible to all without dumbing it down, then please, folks, give to our annual campaign because it definitely takes resources to produce a daily show all year, plus all the other content that we put out, staff, admin, marketing, etc. Our annual campaign is on right now. When you donate to us, major impact. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Okay, Carolyn, I have a question from 2 nights ago. Can a non-Jew if they touch a corpse, spread the tumah to a Jewish friend that may have greeted, shaken hands with, does being non-Jewish make one tamei? I think quite the opposite. I'm not sure. I have to look this up, so I could be wrong. But I seem to remember that tumah and tahor don't apply to non-Jews. So I think that a non-Jew cannot become tamei even if they touch a dead body. But I'm not sure. Because we said that if a human, meaning let's at least a Jew, touches a dead body, which is a father of fathers of impurity, and then so if he touches the corpse, now he is a source of tumah, and then anyone he touches is going to receive first degree tumah. But if that person who touches the corpse is not a Jew, therefore, these laws don't apply to the non-Jew. Is he or she now transmitting tumah? I'm going to have to look it up. I'm just not sure of the answer, and I don't want to answer wrong. Great question. Sharon, if a person is doing the mitzvah of tahara, are they then a source of ritual impurity? For sure. I mean, tahara, which he's talking about, is wrapping a dead body, preparing it for burial. But the thing is, what we all should understand is we're studying these laws so we understand them. But right now, when the temple is not standing, these laws are much more intellectual than practical. Because practically speaking, we're all in a state of tumah. And if the temple was to be rebuilt, we'd have to go through a purification process before we could enter the grounds of the temple. None of us is prepared to enter. We're all in a state of tumah. There's just so much tumah in the world that, we study these laws. These are not laws that we actually enact. In terms of currently what we would immerse and purify for, is the marital laws, like a woman in her menses, then she finishes, she counts 7 days, she immerses in the mikveh, then she and her husband are permitted to each other again. And it's not so much about tumah and tahara with respect to sacred things that they do that. It's a tradition, about immersing to become permitted to each other. It's really not so much about the kind of purity involved to enter the temple grounds. And a non-Jew who becomes a Jew immerses in a mikveh. Now, there's a lot of Jewish men who immerse in a mikveh every day, but they don't say a blessing because they're not fulfilling a commandment. It's just kind of a custom to, kind of think about purity in yourself, and it's sort of like reminding you to help yourself live at a higher spiritual level. But they're not purifying themselves from tumah, so if the temple were standing, they'd be ready to enter. They're not quite there. Bill, a thing that always struck me about the kosher insects is the remarkable practicality of God. That is, that God gave the law to be lived rather than died by. All the kosher insects were ones that could wipe out crops in swarms. Sure, God seems to say to Moses, you won't have quite the same harvest that you planted, but you certainly won't starve. I never thought of that. That's so interesting, Bill. That's so interesting. So when these swarms come and wipe out the crops, we can eat the swarm. Fascinating. It's the first I'm hearing of it. I'd need to learn more. But it sounds possible, probable, and very interesting. Sharon, I'm a bit confused. If rabbinically all outside of Israel are tamei, then why do Kohanim still are so fastidious about not being in a room with a corpse at a funeral or being in a cemetery? Because the minhag, it's not that they, have to be in a state of purity. I mean, we wash their hands, right, before they go up and give the Kohanic blessing during festivals. That's part of the tradition. But we don't ensure that they've been in a mikveh right before they went up to give that blessing. So, yeah, Kohanim, a person who's a Kohen, doesn't enter a cemetery unless it's for a close relative, is very careful not to come into contact or to be in a room with a corpse. But those are traditions and customs associated with being a Kohen in the post-temple age. It's not the same as when the temple is standing and a Kohen has to be in a state of absolute purity before he can not only enter the temple but serve there. Right, so we're talking about different kinds of things. There are a lot of laws that are sort of based on tumah and tahor as they existed then, that became customs over centuries that have the full force of law now, but not for the same reason as those customs were originally done when the temple was standing. And Carolyn says, who are today's sages? Does Judaism expect any more prophets like those of past so long ago? So it's interesting. The tradition says prophecy ended basically at the end of the first temple period, right? Or maybe the beginning of the second temple period. I have to look that up. But it's interesting. Two things went out of the world at the same time. One was the desire of Jews that how do I put it? This strong, almost overwhelming desire to engage in avodah zarah and idolatry, right? So, how many people these days feel the need to bow to an idol and to worship, the stars and, Zeus and Poseidon, whatever, these other gods from other cultures? It's like we know what it is, but we don't really have that urge. At the time that avodah zarah went out of the world, the urge to idolatry, so did prophecy. Isn't that interesting? So no, we don't expect there to be prophets again until the Messiah comes. Who are the sages now? They're not called sages anymore. They're called gedolim. So like the great rabbis in any generation, the poskim, meaning the rabbis who are so learned and so wise and such masters of the halachic, the legal tradition, that they can issue rulings on novel questions. That's not something for your local rabbi, right? But your local rabbi can issue you a ruling, right? So because we have questions all the time, we're not sure, how to handle a particular situation. And that's why a Jew needs to have a rabbi that he can ask questions from, or she can ask questions from. But in terms of the great rabbis of a generation, Moshe Feinstein was one for sure, and his son David Feinstein was another, who tragically just left this world very recently. And of course, different communities, and this is kind of talk about that the way that the community has broken down, so that even though there are very religious Jews, you have Hasidic Jews, and there's many different Hasidic dynasties still. And then you have the Litvish Jews. And these are people who are fully Orthodox and even ultra-Orthodox, but disagree with each other on many, many things. So in one community, they'll say that some great rabbi, is a gadol, is somebody that is on that level or nearly that level of the sages. And in other communities, they would totally disagree. So, that's the time we live in, right? So we can't even agree who the great sages of our generation are, but some people kind of transcend that, So not that long ago, Ovadia ben Yosef, Rabbi Ovadia, died. He was part of the Sephardic community in Israel, and I think there were 1 million people at his funeral. And that was somebody that, in our generation, everybody would agree that he was a great, great sage. Most people in the world would agree that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe of Chabad, who really transformed Jewish practice throughout the world by sending his emissaries, so that there's a Chabad house almost everywhere in the world where a Jew could be, making Judaism available to all Jews in a way that hadn't been before. Most people would agree that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is one of those great, 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 if not like the sages of the Talmud, then close, right, in our generation. But there will be people who disagree with that, for sure. So there you go. That's what I've got for us today. You should be blessed to grow in wisdom every day, in health, in joy, and prosperity, have meaning in your life, and that you should care about these questions, and you should care about the transmission of Torah, and you should want to learn more. And like Yosei ben Yoezer of Tzereida taught, so long ago, and as we met him tonight in this Meet the Mensch episode, that we should make our homes a place of wisdom, a place where sages would be comfortable coming and talking, and we should honor them and sit at their feet, and we should drink in their words thirstily. And let's say Amen.